So for the following examples, interpret the decisions that we made if we reject the null hypothesis and if we fail to reject the null hypothesis. In the first case, we have that a stats professor states that the proportion of his students who pass with a grade of B or higher is 61%. And in the second, we have that a polling place announces that the mean time it takes to vote is less than 15 minutes. When it comes to these kind of tests, the wording here, it can be very picky, and you kind of have to be really careful to parse exactly what it is that is being stated there and what you would get from a rejection or a failure of rejection for the null hypothesis. For one thing, an important part to pay attention to is what the claim happens to be, as that sort of rephrases how you're going to give your final answer. And in that first case, when we're talking about the stats professor, what we should pay attention to there is, again, what that claim is. We talked about this example before in an earlier one, but we have that the claim is that the proportion who pass with a B or higher is 61%. The claim is the null hypothesis because the claim is something with a equality in it. So, if we would reject the null hypothesis, if we reject HO, then we could say something to the effect of, there is enough evidence to reject the professor's claim that the proportion of his students who pass with a grade of B or higher is 61%. Now again, that wording is very picky, the book's going to be very picky. I think there's a little bit more of a window than the book kind of expects you to have. I'll be a little bit more flexible about that stuff than the book would be, just bear that in mind. But again, because we are specifically rejecting the null hypothesis, and the null hypothesis is the claim, we can say that we have evidence to reject the claim. On the other hand, if we were to say something with this, like the proportion is higher than 61%, the B or higher is higher, it's kind of clunky wording, but let's say it's like that, then the claim would be the alternative. And because the claim in that case is the alternative, if we reject the null, we are kind of supporting the alternative, so we would say instead that we have enough evidence to support the claim, blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of really pickiness in that language beyond there, but that's the important part. If you reject the null and you are claiming the alternative, you're kind of supporting the alternative. It's a bit of a flowchart logic to this I may talk about more later. On the third hand, I don't have 3 of those right now. It would be nice if I did. I could raise it right up and prove that point. If we instead were to fail to reject, which is essentially the other possibility. Remember, we're always either rejecting or failing to reject the null hypothesis. That's always what our decision is in terms of, one of those two options. If we fail to reject the null hypothesis and we go back to saying that our claim is that the proportion is 61%, then we are failing to reject our claim. And as a result of failing to reject our claim, we would say something to the effect of, there is not enough evidence to reject the professor's claim that the proportion of his students who pass with a grade of B or higher is 61%. And again, that's very, very picky language. The important thing there, though, is we are claiming the null hypothesis, and we didn't reject that claim, so we would say we failed to reject what exactly that claim states. Or usually, when we're taking this sort of step, we would also say something to the effect of what the level of significance there is. It's an important part of that because that's actually where that evidence being enough is determined. Similarly, for the second, we call it sub-example, part 2. For that, when we're looking at the polling place, again, what we should notice there is what our claim is. The polling place says that the mean time it takes to vote is less than 15 minutes. The mean is smaller, strictly smaller, because that's a strict inequality. That would be something where the claim is in the alternative. The claim being the alternative is actually important because that will determine how we phrase our final answers. So, we are claiming the null, say HO enough times. We are claiming the alternative, but we are rejecting the null, just like what I talked about in that other hypothetical before. If we are claiming the alternative and rejecting the null, then what we are saying is something to the effect of there is enough evidence to support the polling place's claim that the mean time to vote is less than 15 minutes. That is to say, we have supported the claim. On the other hand, if we fail to reject the null, if we fail to reject the null hypothesis and the null hypothesis is not our claim, that is, our claim is the alternative, as it is in this case, then we would say something to the effect of there is not evidence, there is not enough evidence to support the polling place's claim that the mean is as they say it is. So, because our claim is the alternative and we did not reject the null, we're kind of supporting the null, but not really. But more importantly, we are definitely not supporting our claim. On the other hand, if we were going to claim that the mean is specifically 15 minutes or that it's 15 or more minutes, that is, if we were claiming the null instead of the alternative there, and we failed to reject that, then we could say something like, there is not enough evidence to reject the claim that the mean is at least 15 minutes. It's very subtle. I know it's very subtle. It's really easy to make silly mistakes there, just not quite paying attention to that difference. But again, we're going to get practice here. I'm not expecting you to have it perfect just yet. Just understand these are some of the cases. We may talk about it later, about some of the ways you can specifically go through bit by bit what the possibilities are. Anyway, the very last thing we're going to see for this section before actually getting to do some tests is a bit of a recap, going through all the steps for what this process looks like.